Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in on this lovely Thursday to the Smoking Simian podcast yet again. Um, Today, I am speaking to Professor James from University of Rhode Island. How are you today?
Good, good. How's it going?
Real good, real good. I'm happy that you were able to come on here and do this. First, before we get into everything that you do and your areas of research, I just wanted to ask how different is it being a professor now with all the different I'm sure you're very used to Zoom now, where I'm not at all, but I'm sure you're very used to Zoom and very you had to kind of adapt. Is there anything you can speak about that?
Yeah, it's. I mean, I haven't really adapted to it. Haven't really gotten used to it. It's still a weird platform. One of the things that's been hardest for me to adapt to, as I'm more of a sort of improviser, and I'm less of a planner of each thing that I'm going to say and each thing that we're going to do in each sort of
Right.
next step kind of thing in class. I'm a walker, a roamer, and I like the physical engagement. And this
Sure.
kind of platform, you have to sit in one place the entire time. It's hard to have a board. It's hard to really do the things I like to do. So it's been sort of just making the best of it. Um, as like most of the students, just making the best of the situation for the time that we've been in quarantine. But I'm looking
Right.
forward to coming back to the classroom.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I couldn't imagine being a student. I graduated in 2019 in May from Rhode Island College, so I couldn't imagine being a student, during this stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, it is difficult. It's the first semester, well, last year, when we had to stop classes in the middle. Of most of the things that we did were asynchronous, which is mostly recording lectures, posting them online, and then students would engage with the posted lectures, and less in person in front of Zoom. But for this year, it's been largely Zoom, which has been interesting to say the
Right.
least.
Right. Especially for your area of expertise. I mean, you're a professor of philosophy, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I would imagine that's a little tougher to a tougher subject to kind of grasp when you're not in front of somebody and really doing your thing.
That is true. I mean, so much of what we do in class is thinking about what the world is like around us and then directly applying it to some of the stuff that we're talking about in class. And so much of what we do is generated by what students say, and then I riff from there. And the kind of things that they're interested in shapes our conversation. But largely on Zoom, students don't really talk much
Right.
because I know the space is awkward. So it's hard to riff off of their energy. It's kind of like being, from the things you heard about the NBA in a bubble. You kind of have to bring
Right.
your own energy because there's no crowd. And
Right.
so
Right. Right. Right.
it's hard to consistently generate that energy because students don't really know how to interact over Zoom. So a lot of times they're just largely silent. And so or the screens are off because of all these other concerns uh, about privacy and home life and all these
Right.
other things that go into it. So most of the time I'm largely staring at black screens with just names on them. So
Yeah.
so that's something else that's tough as well.
Right. They're almost getting out of having to interact with the whole class and with the professor
Yeah,
in a sense.
and I think they don't know how to interact like online.
Right.
I think that's the other thing too. There's no like crash course on how to teach online really in this context and how to interact online.
Right.
So no one really has mastered it.
So, what are some of the classes that you teach, and what are some of the areas that you kind of focus on?
So I largely teach social philosophy. which is a 200 level kind of class that talks about issues of the social, philosophical, political world. So issues like freedom, justice, democracy, citizenship, individuality, those kind of broad questions. Um,
Right.
I teach that almost every semester. I teach classes in power and justice. I teach classes in continental philosophy, or philosophy from Europe. I'm teaching a class in American philosophy. I teach also in the English department, so I teach African American literature. So it's sort of those general kind of classes, and then every once in a while I'll teach an upper division like specialized class in philosophy. But it's
Right.
mostly those kind of issues and those kind of classes.
Right. Now, as somebody who has only taken one philosophy class my whole life, um, I I'm interested to know what kind of distinguishes or distinguishing variables, I should say, uh, separate each philosophy from each other. Like, what makes continental philosophy different from American philosophy, different from social philosophy? Is it the psychology? Is it the themes?
It's usually focus.
Okay.
So, for example, you can have an ancient philosophy class that reads a series of books by like Aristotle and Plato and the pre-Socratics that came before Socrates and the Roman philosophers, and you get a series of questions that are attached to that genre, to that ancient philosophy genre. And then you can take those same philosophers and put them in a social philosophy class, and issues that were not present in the ancient class will show up in the social philosophy class. So, for example, Aristotle has a book on politics where he has an entire section on slavery and whether or not slavery is part of nature or is against nature. And since a lot of ancient philosophy is dealing with questions of what is real and what is not real about the world, questions of philosophical method, a lot of times questions of like social concerns over slavery are not part of that curriculum, but the part of the social philosophy curriculum. So a lot of it is like method and a lot of it is like framework and the kinds of questions we asked in each class. And we might
Right.
like, there are a lot of crossovers in terms of stuff we read, but a lot of it's just like focus, and the things that we focus on. And then a lot of it comes down to who's teaching the class.
Right.
So I tend to focus on all of the things that a philosopher says, and focus on systems of thought. And other people might focus on certain ideas and certain themes that they want to talk about. And they're not concerned with the overall system. Um,
Right.
I tend to think the systems of thought are more important than themes, but that's just sort of my own approach.
Now, when you say a system, do you mean like when someone says something like existentialism? It's overviewing kind of the whole system of things. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes. So, yes. And part of, so like, let's say that we're reading somebody like Aristotle and for ancient, and he has a whole system of philosophy of science that allows him to start to generate social political arguments. So he has ideas of what nature is and how we come to know something philosophically, and he makes assumptions that are just sort of baked into his theory about what nature is and about how we come to know nature. And then he takes those assumptions and moves them into the social world. And a lot of times when you're doing an ancient philosophy class, you might only concern yourself with his assumptions on the philosophy of nature and not necessarily how they translate to the social world. But when I'm doing
Mm,
like a philosopher as a system, I'm making the argument that what we consider to be the abstract theory doesn't make sense until we put it into practical application in the philosopher's own words themselves. So like you don't understand his theory of nature or metaphysics unless you know his theory of social political thinking. And one really famous example of this is a modern philosopher named Kant. And Kant is famous for creating the modern conception of race that we have today, of this biological trait that passes down through generations. But people who work on Kant largely work on his work on either ethics, which is a sort of rational deductive kind of structure of right and wrong, or they focus on his theory of human cognition, or his theory on human judgment, and his theory of aesthetics. But that's three books. And most people don't read the other stuff that he writes on physical anthropology and geography, which he focuses on race. But if you don't focus on the race element, you don't understand when you're reading the judgment stuff that the judgments and aesthetic values are themselves racialized norms. And you miss out the
Right.
whole real debate that's going on that he's engaged in. And you think he's talking about X, but he's really talking about Y. And so he's
Right.
really talking about race when he's talking about ethics, when he's talking about aesthetics, when he's talking about things of human cognition. But you can sort of isolate those things and ignore the race elements because it complicates the view. But I like complicating views. I like putting it all in front of the students and then saying, what do you think about what this guy's saying?
Right.
Because I don't believe in purity. So I unmask people for who they really are, even if it means that there's some sort of discomfort um, in the canon and with other philosophers.
Right. Now, what's super interesting to me about philosophy was during the one class that I took, um, it's a lot of wording and it's a lot of back and forth, like in the realm of possibility. This could happen, this could happen. The class I happened to take was one on religion.
Mm-hmm.
um, and the more research you do on it, the more there's things of ideas of essentialism,
Mm-hmm.
believing that you're a part of something else that was already created. And then that's when, and another thing that's very interesting to me is when now years later someone like Sartre comes with the idea of existentialism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the being, what is it, the being was here before the essence. So
Mm-hmm.
it's crazy how just because of just the immense realm of possibility there is when it comes to thinking about these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is true. And how much of the kinds of questions we ask reflect on the kinds of people that we already are. And so, with like existentialism, so much of the rejection of faith and the rejection of theology and the rejection of like systems that are concrete and set in place happens after Europe sees the sort of devolution of reason, the devolution of history in Nazi Germany. But when you think, well, that's a perspective that took until 1945 for people to say this system of humanism that spawned democracy, that spawned the rights of man in France, that spawned Declaration of Independence in America, was all considered to be good, going in the direction of civilization. And you say, well, all this time, black and brown people have been telling you something is wrong with what you're saying. And it
Right.
took Nazi Germany to figure out that this thing is not going in the right direction. The reason has failed. History is a failed project. This idea of humanism is a failed project. We need to rethink the whole thing. And
Right.
most African American, African, indigenous people in Central and South America have been making this argument from like the 1800s. And they were just largely ignored by the canon. But in the 20th century, we now reflect and say, "Oh man, they were onto something." It's like they've always been
Right.
onto something. They knew this was a failed project. Europe just didn't want to listen because it was working for them.
Right.
And that's part of the sort of irony of existentialism, that you're finally catching up to what black and brown people have been saying, that
Right.
you just didn't want to listen to for these generations. And that's the interesting thing about doing philosophy, because a lot of times what you'll learn when you're reading a philosopher like a Kant who was racist or held views about racial essentialism in which there's a hierarchy, that he was a product of his time. And that means that nobody at the time was making an argument against this. So like whenever somebody is argued that they're a product of their environment or time, that means within their environment, within their time span of their life, everyone agreed on these principles. But when you realize there were Haitians at the time that Kant was writing who were arguing against him in print. Like there was arguments against Kant. So the fact that everyone
Mm,
agreed with Kant meant they were, they were just racist, not that they had no other counterpoints. And
right.
so that that knocks out the argument that people are products of time, because they're not. People are products of their imagination or their lack of imagination and their racial worldviews. And so if you
Right.
think that somebody doesn't have an argument because they're African, well, that's not a philosophical claim. That's a socio-political claim of power, in which you don't have to listen to somebody because they don't have the sort of authority of will of, with a nation state backing them. And that's less of an issue of understanding and more of an issue of like ignoring somebody's voice. Um,
Right.
so yeah, so I always find those kind of things to be interesting, and I always like to point those things out to my students when we read somebody. Like this person is not the only person making an argument at this time. They're
Right.
just the only person that are listening to themselves and nobody else at the time.
Yeah, that is incredibly interesting that it took hundreds of years and a lot of ignoring, essentially, what you're telling me, um,
Mm-hmm.
for people to even realize that, it's time to rework things, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and that is the I think for me that is the beginning of thinking about all these other non-canonical, non-traditional fields in philosophy that we are now just catching up to, and now everyone's trying to rush to figure out how they can capitalize on it. So how do you capitalize on African American, Africana, Latinx? How do you capitalize on these traditions? Because now they're actually things that are positive within the academy, even though most philosophy departments shun them more or less. They
Right.
are at least things the university is looking at as valuable like assets. But they're basically saying all the stuff that goes into our traditions um, is socially and historically small in terms of its perspective, and in terms of its reach. It doesn't even reach, a tenth of the world population. So it's not even something that is applicable to 90% of people living on the earth at any time.
Right. Right. Right.
And that's what's interesting as well. Um, how, because like if you tell the real story, uh, starting with the Greek philosophers, they were studying in North Africa, North and Central Africa. That's part of the story gets taken out. So all the way up until the medieval period, Africa and the Arab world played significant intellectual role in Western philosophy. And then after sort of the Crusades, all that gets covered over. And we sort of get
Right.
this racialized way we think about the world as Europe being the only thing that contributes. But that's
Mm,
sort of a modern, 1500s to present kind of view. But before
right.
then,
Right.
people acknowledged where the stuff was coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's interesting, something that you said before, and something that I'm kind of thinking about as you're saying all this, um, is a lot of the stuff that started coming out in the 20th century. It's very recent, of course. You think about it, it's very,
Mm-hmm.
very recent. When you think about, because the first thing I think about when I think about philosophy is a bunch of people in Greece, right,
Mm-hmm.
with the curly hair and the togas, and they're
Mm-hmm.
talking, standing around each other. That's what I think. I don't even
Mm-hmm.
think people talk about philosophy anymore in my mind. But
Mm-hmm.
um, with everything that you're saying, there's a whole new emergence that's at least starting, and it comes from African culture, African philosophies.
Yes, and I think that is what is exciting, but is also what is the threat to the purity that people think about when they think about philosophy. They think
Right.
that it doesn't involve itself with social, political, empirical life. It involves itself with the mind. And I think we're starting to see that this is a dead end. And I think with the end of sort of World War II, we can kind of see where reason was leading us to this kind of fascist kind of view, where you can assert things about reality without any verification. Like that,
Right.
that is not a good idea to lead, to have that as your intellectual tradition.
Right. Now, something that I came across when finding your profile on the URI website was you kind of talking about hip hop, and I
Hmm.
also found that you are you love aesthetics essentially. You teach aesthetics, um, and I had to do a little research because I know the word aesthetics, but I understand that it's more of the theory and philosophy of art and
Hmm.
that type of stuff. How are you currently relating your field of philosophy to some of the, I guess, modern arts like hip hop or, anything else like that in that general realm?
Um, I largely relate it through the idea of what constitutes the aesthetic sort of expression, but also aesthetic, appreciation. And so a big part of what I do that is permeates through all of my approach is looking at how any practice is culturally embedded and expresses a worldview of a collection of people, and that the worldview itself might be what they experience objectively about the world, but it is their subjective interpretation of what they think that they could, that they think of when they are experiencing the world from what they consider to be their objective viewpoint. Um, and part of that means that when we think about something like art expression or something like how we take an object and imbue it with a kind of meaning that is external to the object itself. So we can think about like a painting. It's a canvas, and we can create something internally from ourselves onto this canvas, which exists independently of us, but at the same time is an expression of our will in a certain kind of way. And what that says about our relationship to the world and how we reflect that world back on us. So if we think about
Right,
something like hip hop, that's sort of how I think about how it functions as a way of something internal being expressed to the world and existing independent of the person doing it, but somehow being a reflection of that person and of the world generally. And that's a really sort of complex way of talking about um, how people really think about and engage with reality, with what they consider to be what is real about the world. And so much of that is involved with values, what people value, what people um, find meaning in, how they
right,
construct meaning, how other people interpret what they do as valuable and meaningful. Um, and it creates a kind of social ambiguity around hip hop and black art generally because of the relationship that black people have to the modern social world, um, and how we understand what it means to consume black products generally, art, aesthetic products of literature or painting or dance or music. What does it mean for a white audience to it, to find and appreciate that thing that we call black expression? And I can say more about that, but I think that it creates an ambiguity between the artist, the art product, and the audience that I don't know how it's resolvable because of the sort of historical reality.
right. Well, the great thing about art, and it seems like you definitely appreciate art for what it um, is the best kinds are the most authentic kinds. They're the ones
Mhm.
that do exactly what you said. They take the creator's interpretation of something, either a
Mhm.
feeling, how they feel about the world, how they feel about themselves sometimes, and they create something out of it. They create a song, they create
Mhm.
a painting or something like that. And to me, personally, music to me is the most spectacular form of it because you're taking a language that not everybody knows how to speak, right?
Mhm.
Not everybody knows how to read and write music, but everybody understands. super
Mm-hmm.
interesting to me. You're able to create something that the whole world, now you're on a stage and there's thousands of people there, plus everybody in their car listening, and like, it's crazy how
Mm-hmm.
you're able to resonate with that amount of people just with your aesthetic, whatever your art happened to be.
Yeah, and one of the challenges of being an artist is that to be like genuinely artistic, you can't chase social values, and so
Right.
it ends up, so many of the artists are so controversial because the only way to actually produce art is to stand outside of the culture and make a judgment on it. And a lot of times, the values that are in the art are not things that are present in society or things that fundamentally contradict the values we have of society. And that's largely what like hip hop is. It sort of stands outside and makes a social critique, even if the
Right.
social critique is just aesthetic in terms of um, why a turntable has become the instrument of choice over something like a violin, or something like a cello, or something like a piano, or some classical instrument, and why you have classical people like boy, his name just escaped me, who mixes hip hop and classical music.
Scott Storch.
Oh no, he could be one.
Yeah.
I just can't think of his name, but
Yeah.
he's accepted in the jazz world and in the hip hop world because
Right.
he does albums with both. I just can't. I'll think of his name in a second. Um, but like what the conflict was historically with people like Quincy Jones, who looked at people like Kanye and said, "This is noise. This is not music," and um, having to talk to people like a Questlove, who is classically trained in like drums and other sort of instruments, and learning that this was not because like you don't pick up a turntable because you can't do something else. You
Right.
pick it up because it's a different form of instrumentation. And it's recorded music, but there's something you can do with the recorded music by stepping in, by stepping in the break, as they say, or stepping between things. And I think that there's something really valuable about that. Oh, the artist's name is Robert Glasper. It just slipped my mind. But yeah,
Gotcha.
so Glasper sort of does both. So he'll play, a piano, but he'll have a DJ behind him. And there's something
Right.
about that that conversation that's going on, and recorded music being this new thing that people thought was ruining the spontaneity of organic music like blues or something folk music, and how it changed with the recording and the distance between the artist and the audience. But then you get something like hip hop that takes that distance and transforms it into sort of a closeness. So you take a record that's 50 years old, you bring it to something current, and
Right.
you give it to the audience, and now they feel closer to this old record that was considered old and decadent in the past, and now it's like a new life, but it means something new. So there's something really, you know I think, I agree, there's something really transcendent about actually hearing something, but also knowing that your social values, more than likely with hip hop especially, are going to be challenged. So every
Yeah.
value that you think you have, you got to leave it at the door in order to really get what they're saying, and not just write it off as something else.
Right. Right. No, you're right, because that's the first thing people judge right off off a cover.
Mm-hmm.
But when you really listen to it, like for example, one of my favorite artists is DMX. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Forever, I saw him live. He's one of my favorites. And you see that cover of him covered in blood, and it's called what's it called? Flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood. And you're like, I don't know if I want to listen to this.
Mm-hmm.
But if you listen to some of his songs, Slip In, you hear some of his prayers, you hear some of his commentary on his life and other life, and and there's some real deep stuff in there, and people will just write it
Mm-hmm.
off.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like this is like just that alone is sort of a revision of Black religious life, in which you have a cultural reinterpretation, especially like an urban cultural reinterpretation of the meaning of Jesus and God, and Jesus somehow becoming this Black dude who is maligned, by the carceral state that we call like America. And all of a sudden you have Tupac calling himself, Jesus in a certain kind of sense, and thinking
Right.
of himself as being, and Nas does the same thing. Like these are like tropes that are not just in hip hop, but they're like in like Black religious studies. And I think we get like a different version of the divine. Something that really religious, especially Black conservative religious people, call devil music. But
Right.
Black religious people have called everything devil music: jazz, blues, hip hop, secularized religious music like Kirk Franklin was devil's music. Everything's devil's music.
Right.
Um, but I think once you really think about what Blackness is and what it means to live as a Black person, it's hard to find the divine in the world that we're given,
Mm.
and find it cleanly, and see yourself in those stories without tweaking them somehow. And the tweak could be thinking of Jesus as one, like thinking of yourself as a lost tribe of Israel, or thinking of yourself as being crucified like God, or thinking of Jesus as a Black dude who's incarcerated like Fred Hampton, or killed like Fred Hampton. So I think it's hard to find them cleanly. And then you start seeing how Black people are taking this stuff and changing it, even if they're not changing it for the public eye, just tweaks here and there, and what those things might mean.
Right. Another interesting thing that I find when it comes to artistry um, is the I have something I say. I like my artists to have had horrible lives before their explosion, because for whatever reason it creates something phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
With great tragedy comes great comedy, you could say, or great creation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, with the Black community being under such oppression for ages and ages, it's not out of the ordinary that they have created some phenomenal things that now have um, reached the masses, the people who maybe their ancestors were the ones who were being the oppressors. Now
Mm-hmm.
it's everything's flipped. Like, you just think of hip hop. Hip hop
Mm-hmm.
started it was a niche in New York City, and then
Mm-hmm.
now we're having, there's a whole Grammy spot for rap artists.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's another interesting point that I just wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I think that is, and those kind of things, were the questions I was talking about earlier with people consuming Black art and what it means, and how graffiti now is in like major museums. And you say,
Yeah,
these people were being arrested for doing this, for defacing public property. Now it's an art form, and you can like study it at some of the best like art schools in the country. You can study graffiti art with a spray can, and
right.
you think, it's just interesting how things, it's kind of like blues and jazz. They were done in backwoods, and now you can go to Carnegie Hall and put on a tuxedo and be sophisticated and listen to
Yeah,
Bessie Smith. And you say, how do we get here?
yeah,
I ask myself that question every time I teach certain stuff in a classroom space. How did this thing that I'm teaching you get this person killed, and yet we're teaching it now as if it's benign? And like, what does that mean? Because I don't
right.
know. um you know
I
i
think it's always I think it's always like the trailblazers too. The people who
mhm.
started up, they're the ones who they break down the door, but they usually don't see any benefit from it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
And one of the questions I wonder is, do we who are appreciating it now as this sort of transcendent art really understand the radicality of the stuff that we're hearing? So like, do we really understand the fact that like Kendrick Lamar's I Love Myself was being played during the Ferguson rallies when the kids were standing on top of police cars kicking in the windows? Like, what is it that he's saying in this song that would be the anthem for this moment? And why is this song being played on Ellen DeGeneres' show while she's dancing? Like,
right.
like this is dissonance that is hard for me to sort of reconcile, that we can make it benign, but it's got this radical thing in it because of where it's coming from that makes it this great transcendent thing. And yet you see someone like Kendrick Lamar thinking, I don't really want this fame because you're taking what I'm doing as revolution and mainstreaming it.
Right.
And I don't know how I feel. You know, he's got this sort of emotional instability, kind of like Kanye West. Like, how do I make money on this? Like, I don't know what to think about this. I think the same thing when I give talks and I'm like, I'm talking about black people being killed and you're cheering, you're chat, you know, like
Yeah.
you're clapping at the end. And then we have, you know, coffee together in a civilized way. And I'm like, I don't want to, you know, I don't know if I want to do that after what I just said. Cause like, I don't know if I want to get a job talking about this, you know? Um, yeah. So it's one of those things where it's tough to, it's tough to navigate that reality, I think.
Right. So there's you're saying, essentially suggesting that there's just a systematic dissonance between where the art is coming from and how it's, again, being consumed by all types of different people.
Yeah. And I think that on all levels, thinking about what it means to produce radically authentic art is
Mm.
always going to be anti establishment and anti institution, no matter where it's coming from, if it's radically authentic for itself. And then it's somehow being pulled into a mainstream setting where all the radicality is stripped of it. um it's weird, you know, thinking like, for example, Angela Davis was on trial and wanted top 10 by the FBI, and now she's getting paid $30,000 for a speech to say the same things that the FBI wanted her for. And she went to
Right.
court, defended herself, won the court case, and now she's beloved. It's like, how she's saying the same thing she said in the, you know, in the 70s when she was accused of having bombed, you know, having burned down a business as part of the Black Panthers. Or Fred Hampton has a movie out, and it's now it's Oscar nominated. Like, but
Right.
but we killed him, right? Like, the police conspired and killed him, and like all these other people, for the thing that we're now getting people Oscars for. It's
Right.
it's yeah, it's weird. It's a weird feeling. Um,
The biggest example would probably have to be something like Martin Luther King Day.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, most people in the country didn't hate him, black and
Right.
white, when he was alive.
Right.
Um, and I don't know really what you can do with that. You know, I think just recently, it was released that Malcolm X was assassinated by the FBI, not the Nation of Islam. That the people were in the Nation of Islam working as informants that killed him under the auspice of being in the Nation of Islam, but it wasn't the Nation of Islam by itself.
Mm.
And like, you say, like, what do you do with that, given that there's a, that Amazon movie about Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Sam Cooke, and somebody else.
Was it Sammy Davis? One Night in Miami or something?
Yeah, and now that's a thing. And I'm like, people
Yeah.
hated Muhammad Ali. They
Right.
hated Malcolm X. Sam Cooke was, he was Sam Cooke, so he was an artist. We kind of let him skate. But like,
Yeah.
these other figures were not beloved. And so now we can sort of change what they were, change who they were, to make them more palatable, and then they're consumable in a certain kind of way. Um, it is it is a very sort of odd experience,
Yeah.
just seeing it, and then also participating in it as an academic that writes on things.
Right.
It's always odd to sort of cash in on those realities.
From an outside view, it seems very much an exploitation type thing.
It it is
From
very
first glance, at least.
it there is a very kind of, and this is what I was, referring to when I was talking about these sort of ambiguous relationship Black people have to society as art producers. That society that literally commodified Black bodies, and anything that came from the Black body. So Black people couldn't own patents, so the white masters could own the patents. So a lot of the things we think white people created were created by their slaves who couldn't own patents. And so
Mm.
literally, the body itself, and making it reproduce and owning its labor, but also owning the intellectual property of the body, by extension of owning the body. And then taking that mindset and not destroying the mindset, but just updating it. And so now we consume Black art in the same kind of way where 90% of the docents, 90% of the art gallery owners, 90% of the curators are white. Well, I think it's more than that. It's like 99% are white. And that's
Hmm.
African art, African American art, indigenous art, um, Latinx art in the American and European context. And so it's it very much feels like being consumed and not necessarily engaged with, because the only way to consume something is to prepare it for your palate, and people aren't just eating stuff raw, they're preparing it for their palate in whatever way they need
Right.
to. And that kind of, because like when you want to give it in a raw form, those kind of things are not usually accepted, which is why it's so weird people love Kendrick Lamar. It just it strikes me as bizarre. Or people love Snoop Dogg now, and I'm thinking, did we just forget what he did? Or like
Yeah,
Ice
I know.
Cube, like Ice Cube's in Disney movies. Did we
Right.
not know who Ice Cube is? Like, how do we
Yeah.
forget that so quickly?
Yeah.
But yeah, it is very, it's weird. It's very weird. Snoop especially, because I remember growing up listening to Snoop and watching religious figures and people who were in Congress and the Senate, buying his albums and bulldozing them and getting bullhorns and protesting outside of Death Row Records, saying that he was anti-black and all these sort of things. And now he's on TV with Martha Stewart.
Right.
It's just 20, 30 years, so it's not even,
Right.
decade, like, millennia. It's like 30 years.
Right.
um
But you could also say that there is a sense of, I wouldn't say urgency, but there probably is a desire amongst certain artists to get in that mainstream, to put themselves in a different, just in a different position, give themselves a wider, like for example, Snoop Dogg back in the day, they would never would have put him on with Martin Luther, with Martha Stewart. Um,
mhm.
but like now, the character that he's not the character, the person that he's kind of grown into, it's like, okay, we can, I guess, throw him together with her.
Yeah, and I think it is a deliberate choice by the artists themselves. So like, for example, if you listen to like Common's second album, Resurrection, and he's got a song called Communism, and he talks about, like, he has a line that says it's a common market and there's so much competition, but to me competition is none. He says my product is a compact disc, so you have to buy it. And he said I will never compromise and sell out like Master P. And then
Mm,
2 albums later, and like Water for Chocolate, he says it's a shame that I have to sell my soul to white labels to put food on the table. That's 2 albums later. We're not
right.
talking about decades. We're talking about 10 years. He needs money. So what does he do? He mainstreams himself, and now you see him at the White House. You see him on all these things like that, and you say, hold on, how did this guy go from saying, I have styles that's overwhelming, and and he says, and I get more hoes than Spelman. And I was like, so he talks about Spelman College and hoes,
Yeah.
which would have gotten him blackballed, and now, and now he's the most sensitive black dude ever. I'm like, hold on, don't
Right.
y'all listen to his music? Because he says all sorts of stuff that Snoop Dogg says and all these other people say, but he's a conscious rapper.
Right.
And I think it's just so much of I think so much of it is just how we kind of dumb down black life to make it palatable for consumption. And we
Mm,
don't want it to be complex. We don't want it to be ugly. We don't want it to be all the things that it is, along with it being beautiful. We don't want those things, so we simplify it to the most common denominator, distance ourselves from it, and that makes it somehow something we can have present in our lives in a way that in the raw form, there's no way we're going to have it present.
right. Well, I think it's a horrible injustice when an artist is forced to you know, kind of essentially dumb down or refine whatever they're creating,
Hmm.
just to satisfy, the commercials or the owners or whatever, whatever the art form is, writing, music, comedy, whatever the hell it is.
Hmm.
That's why I get super excited when you hear about an artist has their own masters now. Like for whatever reason, every
Yeah.
time I think of, like for example, the other day I watched Ray for the second time. Phenomenal movie.
Hmm.
And there's the scene where he's talking about he negotiates his contract and he gets his masters, and I'm like,
Hmm.
wow, he did that ages ago, and there's still people today that are constantly
Yeah.
in this battle, and there's only a select group of artists that really are allowed to own their own masters.
Yeah. And have any kind of control on the front end of the production, and then ownership on the back end. And those
Right.
things are, and are difficult. And one of the, that's one of the reasons why it's interesting when you see artists that are more or less independent, and how we think about them as this sort of radically unique and different thing, when
Mm-hmm.
most artists could be that way if they're willing to stake their own sort of future, and be sort of in control of their own fate. But there's so much money floating around that it's
Oh yeah.
hard to imagine turning it down. I remember when I
Right.
first got to graduate school, I was sitting in a professor's office, and he was this like famous, really famous white guy. And he says to me, "If you stick with me, I can make you famous like Cornel West."
Mm.
And I said to him, I was 22, so I was brash. And I said, "Man, that sounds like what people eat." I said, "Man, that sounds like what pimps say. Like,
Right.
like I'm gonna make you famous. I'm gonna put you on the stage." And I said,
Yeah.
"Man, what makes you think I want to be famous like Cornel West? Like, what makes you think that all black people care about is your acceptance and your values of valuing me? That
Mm.
like, I care that you can make me. I care about being famous. Because if you're famous, that doesn't mean that you're famous in your neighborhood. It doesn't mean you're famous to your people. It means you're famous to white majority audiences that can pay you what they think is your value." I said, "Well,
Right.
that means that you assume that that is my goal. And you assume that black people only care about fame. They don't care about intellectual integrity. They don't care about ideas. They don't even care about sacrificing wealth and power for integrity. Like, you just assume all those things aren't the case, and you know nothing about me. We just met. So it's not like we
Right.
had a rapport over years, and my background, my father. Like you don't even know who my parents are, if I have parents at all.
Yeah.
Like you assume I don't because I'm black. But like, you don't even know who my parents are. Like, what am I,
Yeah.
like, what if my father's a black radical Marxist? That
Right.
changes everything, doesn't it? If he's a black capitalist, that changes everything. You know, and to not even know that, and that be the first thing they say, that's sort of what I mean by, making you into something that they want you to be, so that they can consume you in the way they're comfortable consuming you. Because if I was a black radical Marxist, and there's nothing you can give to me that I want, then that changes our power dynamics, and you have to relate to me in a completely different way. And if you don't know what I want in life, because I won't tell you, that also changes our relationship. And from that moment forward, it was more or less a tense relationship, because there was nothing to leverage my obedience or acquiescence with. So, there's nothing to hold over your head to say, if you don't do X, you won't get Y.
Right.
Because, and that's the thing that is, I think, what plagues a lot of black people when they're faced with choices of um, economic, social, political existence, that you run into having to negotiate those things.
Now, listening to you talk, you're obviously very passionate. You're very knowledgeable. Not only because you have degrees, but because it's the life you live. You what brought you, or when did you first realize that you wanted to learn more about your history? A history that just so happened to be, as we've been talking about this whole time, either exploited or forgotten about? What really got you to start asking the big questions? Like, I want to learn more about where my people come from.
Well, I guess I started thinking about most of the stuff that I mean, maybe it was in college because I went to Morehouse undergrad, um, and it was less of at Morehouse. It was less of a study of like Black people and more of a kind of temperament that was created where you were, I guess, intellectually aggressive is the best way I can frame it. It was a kind of ferocity because undergrad, it was in the 90s, undergrad in early 2000s was radically nothing like you all experience today. There were no
Mm.
student evaluations, there was no complaining to deans or chairs. It was just you thrown into a room with your peers, and they threw a stick down, broke it in half, and said only one person's coming out, and you just went after it. And so it was a
Mm.
kind of ferocity that made me say to myself, whenever I read something, this is not the full story. There's always more to the story. So let me read what you're not giving me, and let me figure out what you're not telling me and why you're not telling me. And that made me question everything that I got hold of. And I discovered I was on a job interview. This is related, so I'm not segueing completely. I was on a job interview, and they asked me what I thought about diversity and inclusion. And when I give you when I tell you what the answer was that I gave, you can imagine whether or not I got a call back. So I was on a job interview, and they said, "So what do you think about diversity and inclusion?" And I said, "I think diversity and inclusion are a waste of time." And they said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "If you told the real story, we wouldn't need diversity and inclusion, because none
Mm.
of the stuff that we have that's American or European is pure. It's always borrowed from something else. It's always stolen from something else. And that something else is always covered over. But if you told the real story about where your intellectual history, where your social, political, economic history, where your technological advancement, scientific, biological, medicinal, all the stuff comes from, we wouldn't need separate classes because you would tell a whole story that did not include just white people. And so we wouldn't need Africana studies if you didn't isolate everything as European to begin with. And
Right.
because you've chosen to do that, we have to counterbalance that with ethnic studies, Africana studies, Latinx studies, women and gender studies. And if you would just tell the truth and stop lying to people about how the world is and where it came from, all this diversity and inclusion stuff would fall out the window. But that would also mean that all these white people who call themselves educated would have to read a whole bunch more than they do, and they
Right.
read only half the story, and they don't get fully what the truth is. And so, like, that was part of my sort of, I guess, intellectual from my parents, from undergrad, or maybe just personal. It's just in me to always ask that question. Because
Right.
whenever somebody presents something to me, like a syllabus, I say, well, this is your version of the truth. Let me go figure out what you're not telling me. And then I'll come to class and we'll just have it out. And that's usually what happened. And I remember in my first year in grad school, our first class, there was this person, this guy, he was French. So everyone thought he was smart because he spoke French. And I said, you wouldn't think he was smart if he was Haitian, but because Haitians speak French too.
Right. Yeah.
So the Senegalese, but you don't think they're smart. So he was this French guy, and he was speaking in French, and he was in class just making stuff up. I mean, because I had read for class, and I'm like, that's not in the book. He's like, oh, so and so said this. I said, no, he didn't. And the guy says, well, what do you mean? He didn't. He just kept lying. So I took my book, slid it across to him, gave him a highlighter. I said, stop with the conversation, open the book, and show me what you're saying is in the book, and show me where it is, because you're lying. And
Mm.
everyone in the class was like, whoa, you can't do that. I said, the guy's clearly lying. It's not in the book. I'm telling you, it's not in the book. He's making it up. And they stopped the class and said, okay, let's take a timeout. And the professor said, what was that about? I said, what about? You just like embarrass somebody in this like really aggressive way. I said, oh, this is what we did at Morehouse. Like, you make something up, you get called out, and you go to battle. If you can't
Mm.
justify it, you're quiet the rest of the time until you can justify it. And if you don't like it, go read more. And that was kind of how we engage with one another. So when I think about like, learning the full story and incorporating all these voices that were not part of the canon, but were existing simultaneous or parallel to, and a lot of times perpendicular, like stuff was being borrowed. Um, that it makes me say, in order to be an educated person, but also to be like a morally just person, you got to know more than just the stuff that makes you look good and feel good about yourself. And so, um, I know that, for example, in America, that this is not just slavery happened, then slavery ended, and then by the 1960s we started doing stuff. I know that's not the story. I know
Mm.
that when people got off the boats, they had significant amounts of skills that the people enslaving them did not have. I know when slavery ended, there were a whole bunch of white people out of a job because they had no actual technical skills to do anything other than rule over another person. They weren't
Right.
blacksmiths. They couldn't work the land. They knew nothing about animals. And so what are they going to do? Like the masters knew nothing, the overseers knew nothing. He had all these slaves who had all these skills, and they started building all these rich towns, and then the white people burned them down. Like but those aren't things that you're being told. But if you hear the history of all the black people doing all the work, it just makes you start asking, well, what happened to those people when slavery ended? Because those skills didn't go away. What happened to the
Mm.
white people who had no skills but were only had political power? What happened to that relationship? Where did the Klan come from? And those kind of questions. And it starts to make you ask those kind of questions. And even in philosophy, if they're talking about this idea, what is the history of this concept that they're engaging in a larger context? And that usually tells you a much different story than the one you get in the classroom. And I end up following into that kind of thing. And it did cost me a lot. I mean, I won't lie. It cost me a significant amount. Being put out of graduate programs, those sort of things. Um, Going from job to job a couple of years, not long, not like some other people. And knowing that had I played the game the way that they wanted me to, I probably would have been 5 years more advanced than I am now.
Right.
But the idea of, well, I don't owe anybody any favors. So I'm kind of free. In a sense, I'm debt free, not student loan debt. But I don't, nobody can call me up and say you have to do X because,
Right.
you won't get a job without me. And so I don't have those kind of debts. So I have like a kind of freeness of my mind to write and do exactly what I want because I don't have any debts to settle.
Right. And that's what you give up when you go with that mainstream move, or that
Mm-hmm.
guy that said I can get you as big as Cornell West. You maybe now you'd have to be doing a whole bunch of
Mm-hmm.
things for him. And
Exactly.
yeah.
Because they're gonna call you up. And I said, man, I don't
Right.
know you. You're not my kin. Like you're not my cousin, my uncle. So you're not doing stuff for free. So what are you getting out of it? Because everybody gets
Right.
something out of it. And that was my question. Like that's that language of exploitation. Well, what are you getting out of this?
Yeah,
Such that
yeah,
you're
yeah.
willing to give it to me. Because whatever you're getting, so like whatever you're giving to me, I know you're getting even more. It's sort of like when somebody offers you a big contract, you know that there's more money to get because they're giving you this amount. So there's more that they're making on you. And so that was my question. Like, well, so who's paying you so that you can pay me? And that was always my question. And those kind of questions, you can imagine, did not, were not well received of asking those kind of questions. Like, so what's your angle? Because the
Right.
assumption was you trust me. And from growing up in the South, we don't trust anybody just because they tell you something. You always verify it. And it's not personal. I was like, I don't think you're a liar, but we always in the South verify things before we just take them wholesale. That's just kind of our tradition. And especially going to a black college, we verify everyone, not just white people. We verify what everyone says. I don't trust black people just because, you know, we look alike. Like, no, I'm gonna verify what you say, then I'll come back, then we can talk.
Right.
But Those were the kinds of questions that I was always asking.
Well, that's super important because without the only way to correct incorrect information is to come with the correct information,
Mm-hmm.
um, with the correct rhetoric, essentially. So, asking questions, I mean, it's something that we're told in school at a young age, but it's not really like pushed on us. They're like, oh yeah, ask questions,
Yeah.
but like normal questions, not like, what did Christopher Columbus actually do when he was here?
Mm-hmm.
Or something like that, like a teacher doesn't want to deal with that, especially from a child, from a third grader. Um,
Yeah. And I used to get put out of class with it was fifth grade. It was social studies. And the teacher would put me out probably once a week because I would just argue just the points that were being made. Like, I don't think that's true. Like, oh,
right,
well, so and so did X and then they did Y. I'm like, well, that's it. Life is always more complex than that. So what more did they do? Oh, well, there's nothing more complex than that. I'm like, well, no, more than likely it is, and I'll figure it out. And then I would come back, and I would talk to my parents, and maybe my parents were black nationalists. I don't know. Um, and I would come back and say, hey, I got a hold of another book, and this book says everything you're saying is just not true. And then they
mm.
would say, go to the principal's office, and I'd say, okay, well, I'll come back next week because you can't really get rid of me
right,
for asking questions. But I mean, so much of what I want for my students and from my students, even with me, is to challenge everything I'm saying to you. Because I'm going to tell you this is how I'm reading this book. And here's all the evidence surrounding the book from what the author says, from what the conversations the author was in, from what other people said around the author and about the author that makes me come to this conclusion. You go read the stuff and tell me what conclusion you come to. Don't just take my word for it because this is my view. And you should
right,
be as like strong in your opinion, but having done the background to see whether or not what I'm saying is true. Because you don't know me personally. I might be a good person. I might be lazy. I might be a bad person.
right,
And people get bad information for various reasons. A lot of times it's because people don't want to read. And people, because it takes a lot more effort to learn the nuances than the general story. Sometimes people get bad information because people are not good people and they intentionally lie to them. But a lot of times it's because to know something beyond what you're taught, it takes more effort. And most people don't want to give that effort. But it's up to the students to know what they're not learning. Not details, but to know there's more to the story and to ask, well, what does this mean? But that also means you have to be courageous in a certain sense and be willing to sacrifice.
right,
That's a big thing that I think is hard to sort of swallow. Be willing to sacrifice without knowing what the final outcome is going to be. Because that's just the notion of the nature of sacrifice. You got to
right,
act without knowing consequences,
right.
which is tough. Um,
It is
I
tough.
don't, yeah, I don't normally tell students to sacrifice because I'm not their parents, and people have obligations beyond just me in a classroom space. But my view is that you always should be willing to sacrifice. But I'm never going to recommend you to give up everything for truth because everyone's in different positions.
Right, right. Well, before we wrap this thing up, I wanted to ask you about if there's anything that you're kind of working on now, any papers, any type of research that you're focusing on at the moment.
Yeah. Right now I'm working on a book for a press called Bloomsbury. It's mostly a professional press that publishes books like Harry Potter, but they also publish like academic text as well. And I'm
Okay.
writing something that's trying to be more on the public intellectual side than the strictly academic side. And it's on the question of how to read Black literature and Black text generally. And by text, I mean Black affect, um, Black ways of arranging internal furniture and other things in the house, Black ways of engaging in terms of language, in terms of embodiment, in terms of music. So all the ways in which we think about how we engage the world what does it mean to write a book that is looking at those details and analyzing what it means to think about this? And some of it is, the good thing about the press is that they're willing to be or allow kind of experimental ways of thinking about it. Because one of the things that I say is that if we have traditional ways of doing philosophy, they're not really ever going to capture Black life in an everyday kind of sense. They'll capture it in a conceptual sense, but not in an empirical or in a sort of uh, uh, a sense of self-conscious realization. And that, so some of it is, a lot of the book is kind of fiction, science fiction, alternate reality, alternate dimensional kind of things, to think about what it would mean to conceptualize the world in a world that doesn't yet exist. And that's where the
Mm.
parallel realities come in as a way of navigating this space. Um, and One of the things that I argue is that most of the Black writers that we know of, that we think of as political writers, as abolitionists, as liberation theorists, all wrote science fiction or fiction, almost every single one of them. And the reason I make I argue that the reason that this is because um, empirically, at a certain point, you have to stop trying to understand the world for what it is, because you can't project the future from that space. And you can only talk about the way the world has been and the way the world currently is. But when you're trying to speculate about what it would look like for the world to be different in the future that hasn't yet existed, you have to go largely into the speculative, because there's nothing to empirically ground your theory. So, what does Black
Right.
freedom look like in this world? It's hard to imagine what it would look like, because the world in which we engage has this sort of juridical or punitive aspect surrounding Black people. So, legal systems or criminal systems or social systems that are largely punitive in relationship to Black life. Um, and so, what does it look like to function in a space in which you never think about these things when you're thinking about your own life? What would that look like as a speculative question? And
Right.
this came about largely because when COVID broke out and people started making governors were making mask mandates. Um, Good Morning America, of all shows, imagine Good Morning America, had a segment on Black men, and Black men were willing to leave the house and risk catching COVID, knowing the bad consequences potentially of this, because they said catching COVID is a lot better in terms of my health risks in the future than it is going out to the public and putting on a mask as a Black dude and going into a store. I'm
Mm.
not doing that because I will be shot. I would rather get COVID than risk. And I said, what kind of choices are these to make, that you would rather risk getting a disease that is causing a global pandemic because being Black creates a kind of pandemonium that is much worse than a pandemic. So how would we think about freedom in this case? It would always have to be speculative, because I've thought about those things in going into a store. I put on a mask and immediately I came to mind, I think, I even imagine that I'm going to rob the store and I'm a Black person.
Right.
So imagine what other people think about me when this thing first started. Like, I'm not wearing a bandana. I'm going to go
Yeah.
and get the best medical mask I can find, even if it's $50. And I'll put it on, and I won't put a hoodie on, and I will do this and I'll do this. And what does that mean about how I imagine my life? That
Right.
means that my theory of freedom is radically different than somebody who goes and gets a red bandana, ties it around their head, and goes into a store and never thinks about it. And so, how do we think about the um, speculative um, future and what freedom looks like? It has to be in the realm of fiction, especially science fiction, which is why Black science fiction is so important, because that, I think, is where our real Black political theory comes. It doesn't come in
Mm,
this empirical world. It always comes in speculative. And if you read like King's speeches, Martin Luther King speeches, they're always about the future, and they're always about something that can't be proven in some mountain. Like I'll get to the mountaintop and I'll look down. It's like, well, we're always climbing the mountain. So what is on the other side? What did you see when you say I've been to the mountaintop and I've looked over and I've seen I've seen the promised land? What did that look like? Because Moses died before he got into the promised land. He never saw it. So what
right.
does this look like? And that's biblical, that's revelation, that's speculative, that's science fiction. Like that to me is like reading a science fiction text, reading, where do we go from here, or Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Those are science fiction texts as much as like J.R.R. Tolkien or any of these other texts. Because freedom is like dwarfs to me. you
Right.
know, and it's kind of weird to say that, but that's kind of how I think about it. I don't know how the audience will take that analogy, but it's kind of
Hey,
like
they'll take
thinking
it however
about,
they take it.
yeah, it's like playing, Quidditch or whatever people play in Harry Potter, those kind of things.
Right. Right. No, I see. It's a very interesting idea that you'll be using a like a science fiction lens or science fiction universe. Um, and it sounds so out there, but the way that you're putting it out on the table and describing it to me as a black man, it's like, okay, their sense of freedom or your sense of freedom is like, sure, I think that it's funny you put a mask on. Oh, I feel like I'm robbing this place, but there's no true sense of fear. I'm not afraid of that at all. That I'll get in
Mhm.
trouble with that, or I'll get into some provocative situation. But it's super interesting that you'll be bringing to light the this idea of a different universe,
Mhm.
and comparing it to the freedom of black people today.
Yeah, and I think that even today people are still writing fiction, and when you see even like a Kahindi X, How to Be an Anti-Racist, or any of these kind of books like that, or like white ally books or white fragility books, or any book on critical whiteness studies, they're always speculative. They're empirical until they get to a certain point, and then the question of, well, how do we fix this? So you ask Tim Wise, okay, you give me the grand theory of whiteness and where whiteness is and what it is. Now you get to the point of, well, what are we going to do about it going forward? It's always speculative because there's nothing to empirically point to say this is what's happened in the past and this is how it's worked.
Right.
Because there have been changes, and those changes are reversed. So we have a Voters' Rights Act, and then we have the repeal of it. We have Brown v. Board, and then we have the repeal of it with charter schools and private schools. So like there's always these steps in which we imagine what the future is, and then we get to that future and we realize it's not what we thought it was going to be. And so we have to imagine another future. And so this is sort of, I think, the pattern, which is why so many of these figures were writing science fiction, because that is the best way to imagine what the future is. And to think that somebody like a Frederick Douglass in 1850s was writing science fiction, or to think that like a Martin R. Delaney was writing science fiction. And this is in the 1850s. So the idea that science fiction is this like elite kind of thing that you can like let your imagination roam in a world that doesn't yet exist is only within the realm of fantasy that is sort of like Dungeons and Dragons in people's imaginations. But most black science fiction is not Dungeons and Dragons in the realm of
Right.
fantasy. It's in the realm of the actual, in which you imagine a future based on the current and past conditions. So it's not in a completely novel universe of Middle Earth. It's always somehow grounded in reality, but then at the moment in which you imagine what freedom or justice or equality or humanity looks like, it just sort of makes a quick divergence into a parallel world in which you
Right.
can imagine and sort of let your imagination roam in that world. So yeah, I always say black speculative fiction or black political theory is nothing like white science fiction or white fantasy novels. Um, it's more like black science fiction is black political theory.
Mm.
And I've had a lot
It's
of political
rooted somewhere
theorists.
else.
Yes, and I've had a lot of political theorists who are relatively well known at dinners agree with me. In public, they're like, absolutely not. I'm not going there with you. But privately, yeah, I agree. Because I'm like, how do you read David Walker? Like, this is not anything, in David Walker's appeal. Appeal is something speculative. The very language of appeal is speculative because it's not concrete and bounded. So it's always open ended. So even the appeal, which is one of the more famous pieces, is speculative. And we can just sort of go through all the Black political theory from like the mid 1800s into present. And it's always, like Eddie Glaude's new book on James Baldwin is called Begin Again. So it's about beginning again. So like, how is that not speculative? Like that means that something that we began the last time didn't work. So we have to begin again. But we need new eyes to reformulate. So let's go to James Baldwin. But it's always, let's reformulate this, start over, and then push forward again. And then in 20 years, we'll reformulate based on the stuff we're reading today and push forward. And so it's always this sort of moving trying to chase the horizon kind of thing. And as long as you know that's speculative art, I'm okay with saying that this is what Black political theory is. Because I think there's something liberatory in saying that kind of thing. And it's not hopelessness, but it's kind of liberatory in saying there's some value in chasing the horizon more than it is making up what reality is because it doesn't meet what you want it to be.
Right. Well, my man, when before we wrap this up, what's the timeline on that? Do you think it'll be done soon or
2023? It's the timeline.
Okay.
So I just finished a book on Black men in literature last year. So this is the second book. So I just started writing it. It's about a third done, but with all these kind of things, I try to have as many footnotes as possible to sort of to make, to sort of direct the reader on where to go for secondary things to read more about this idea. If it was just writing it, I could probably get it done in a year, but like really getting into the background of like pointing out where to go in all these different cases. I'm looking at movies that are coming out, old movies, comparing them, poems, all sorts of things. Like anything can go in there. Anything to find that I draw inspiration from. I'm looking at the last scene of Cooley High, where Cochise is dead and Preach finds him. I'm looking at that moment. Like I just find things. So like, I'm giving myself 2 years to sort of put a rough, a hard stop on it and stop looking for new stuff to write on and just have that. And that be the book. So 2 years, 2023, which is sooner than you can imagine.
It is, yeah, always. Well, hey man, thank you very much for coming on. I'm happy we got something to work out. I know you're a busy guy, busy schedule. Is there you got a website or social links, anything you want anybody to find you at?
Just really Googling. I'm not, I need to be, my wife tells me I need to be on the social media world. I need to get into Twitter. Probably not TikTok. I'll get myself in trouble on TikTok.
No.
But at least Twitter, because I'm too old for TikTok, apparently. All my students were like, we're not doing TikTok if you're on it. So at least Twitter. I need to get a web page. That will be forthcoming. So be on the lookout for it. Eventually somebody will just make me do it. Maybe this summer I'll get to it and sort of create my sort of, online platform. But now it's just mostly Google searching, seeing stuff that I'm working on and following me that way.
Okay. Well, all right, my man. Guys, make sure you link in my description for all my social pages to follow me on. And that's it. I'll talk to you guys on Monday. Thank you again, sir.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.
Take care.
All right.